The security camera captured it all. 11:47 p.m. A woman dying in childbirth. Monitors screaming. Blood pressure critical. Her husband looked at his phone, then at her, then walked out. He chose a text message over his wife's life, over his unborn son's fighting to survive. 3 years later, she walked into his wedding wearing the truth he tried to bury. What happened in that courtroom would destroy a billionaire family and rewrite everything you think you know about justice. This is the story of Grace Bennett, the woman left to die who refused to stay dead. If you believe karma is real, smash that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe because this story proves that sometimes the abandoned become unstoppable. Let's begin. The security camera timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when Carter Sullivan made the choice that would destroy everything. In the stark fluorescent light of Mount Sinai Hospital's labor and delivery wing, his wife Grace Bennett lay dying, her blood pressure climbing to 180/120. The monitors screamed warnings that pierced through the sterile air like desperate prayers no one could answer. Grace's swollen fingers clutched the thin hospital blanket, her wedding ring cutting into flesh that had doubled in size over the past week. Two lives fought inside her, twins struggling against the poison of eclampsia that turned her own body into their enemy. She could barely see through the haze of pain and medication, but she saw enough. She saw her husband of 3 years staring at his phone instead of holding her hand. "Carter," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos of medical equipment. "Don't leave me, I'm scared." He didn't answer. His thumb moved across the screen, reading a message that lit his face with something Grace had never seen before. Not concern, not fear, relief. The text was from Vivian Ross, "Come now or we're done. I mean it this time." Carter's pulse quickened, but not from worry about his wife. He looked at Grace, then at the phone, then at the door. The calculation happened in seconds. Dr. Elena Ford burst into the room, her surgical cap already in place, barking orders to the nurses who swarmed around Grace's bed like bees protecting a failing hive. "We need to move now." "Doctor," Ford said, "her blood pressure is critical. Where's the father? We need consent for emergency transfusion." "I'll be right back," Carter said, already backing toward the door. "Just need to make a call. Work emergency." Grace tried to speak, but her tongue felt thick and useless. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before they rushed her toward the operating room was Carter's back as he walked away. His shoulders relaxed, his stride purposeful. He wasn't coming back. She knew it the way you know winter is coming when the first leaf falls. Some truths arrive fully formed, requiring no proof, no explanation. They simply exist, cold and absolute. Ford noticed the empty chair where Carter should have been sitting. She exchanged a glance with the head nurse, Sarah Bennett, a distant cousin of Grace's who had pulled strings to get her assigned to this delivery. The look said everything words couldn't. "Is he coming back?" Sarah asked quietly while prepping the IV line. "No," Grace whispered. Then louder, with what little strength remained, "Save my babies. Please, just save them." The operating room doors swung open and swallowed her whole. The world became bright lights and masked faces and the sensation of falling, even though she lay perfectly still on the table. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Dr. Ford's steady voice counting down, felt the cold bite of the anesthetic, and then nothing. Nothing at all. Across town, Carter's Mercedes glided through rain-slicked streets toward Vivian's luxury apartment in Tribeca. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, but not from guilt, from excitement, from the intoxicating taste of freedom he'd been craving for 9 long months. Vivian opened the door wearing silk and expensive perfume, her dark hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. She pulled him inside, and he let himself be pulled, let himself forget the monitors and the screaming alarms and his wife's desperate eyes. "You did it," Vivian breathed against his neck. "You actually did it. It's over," he said. The words tasted like champagne, fizzy and sharp. "I can't do this anymore. The pregnancy, the neediness, the constant demands for attention." Vivian stepped back, her expression shifting to something Carter couldn't quite read. "There's something I need to tell you." She reached for a small, white stick on the marble counter, the kind with 2 pink lines that change everything. Carter's stomach dropped. "I'm pregnant too," she said. 8 weeks. The champagne taste turned to ash. Back at Mount Sinai, in Operating Room 3, Dr. Ford worked with the focused intensity of someone racing against death itself. The first incision, the controlled case of too much blood and not enough time, Grace's blood pressure dropping, alarm screaming again. Different now. More urgent. We're losing her, someone said. Then two cries cut through the noise. Thin and uncertain at first, then stronger. Two tiny humans announcing their arrival to a world that had nearly killed their mother to birth them. It's boys, Doctor, Ford said, her voice thick with relief and exhaustion. Twins, Noah and Logan Bennett. She looked at Grace's pale face, unconscious but alive. Barely. Where the hell is the father? Ford said to no one in particular. Where the hell is he? The nurse checking Grace's vitals had tears in her eyes. Gone, she said simply. Doctor, Ford's jaw tightened. She had delivered hundreds of babies in her 20-year career. She had seen every variation of joy and tragedy that came with bringing life into the world. But she had never seen a man walk out on his dying wife mid-labor. Never. Get those babies to NICU, Ford ordered. And someone find out if this woman has family. She's going to need them. In the recovery room hours later, Grace woke to silence. No husband, no babies. Just the steady beep of monitors and the gray light of dawn creeping through the window blinds. Her body felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but pain. A nurse appeared, her face kind but careful. Your babies are in NICU. They're stable, breathing on their own. You did good. Where's Carter? Grace asked. Even though she knew, the nurse hesitated. We haven't been able to reach him. Grace turned her face toward the wall. She didn't cry. Tears required energy she no longer possessed. Instead, she lay there feeling the weight of abandonment settle over her like a second skin, permanent and suffocating. Her phone sat on the bedside table. Notifications silenced but screen glowing with missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. When she finally picked it up, her hands shaking, she saw the messages. Bank alert joint account withdrawal, $87,000. Withdrawn at 12:03 a.m. Insurance portal coverage terminated effective 12:01 a.m. Policyholder request. And finally, a single text from Carter, sent at 4 in the morning. We should separate. It's better for both of us. Grace stared at those words until they blurred into meaningless shapes. Better for both of us. As if mutual benefit mattered when one person lay broken and the other walked away whole. Sarah, her cousin, entered the room carrying two photos from NICU, Noah and Logan, tiny and pink and covered in wires, but alive, fighting. They're beautiful, Sarah said softly, placing the photos in Grace's trembling hands. Grace looked at her sons and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking. Opening like a door she didn't know existed, suddenly revealing light on the other side. He's gone, Grace said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Sarah nodded. I know. The babies need me. Yes. Then I need to survive. It wasn't a revelation or an epiphany. It was simply the truth. Stripped of everything except what mattered. Grace Bennett had died on that operating table at 11:53 p.m. The woman who woke up was someone different, someone harder, someone who would do whatever it took to protect the two lives that depended on her. Outside the window, New York City woke to another morning, indifferent to one woman's private apocalypse. But inside room 417, Grace made a decision that would echo through the next year of her life. She would not break. She would bend, crack, shatter into pieces so small they couldn't be counted. But she would not break, because broken things stayed broken. And she had two sons who needed her whole. Grace discharged herself from Mount Sinai after 48 hours despite Dr. Ford's protests. The babies remained in NICU, still too fragile for the outside world. But Grace couldn't stay. Every minute cost money she no longer had, and every hour in that room where Carter abandoned her felt like drowning. Aunt Ruby Bennett arrived in a taxi she couldn't afford, her 60-year-old frame still strong from decades as a divorce attorney. She took one look at Grace's hollowed-out eyes and said nothing, just wrapped her arms around her niece and held on. You're coming home with me, Ruby said. Not a question, a command. The apartment in Queens was small, a one-bedroom walk-up that smelled like coffee and old books. But it was safe. Ruby made up the couch with clean sheets and set out towels like Grace was a guest instead of a refugee. Grace sat on the couch edge, still wearing the hospital gown under Ruby's borrowed coat, and finally looked at her phone. Most messages were congratulations from friends who hadn't heard the news yet, but three stood out. The first was from Carter's father, William Sullivan Grace. I heard about the delivery. Congratulations. I'd like to discuss arrangements. We're family. Call me. The second was from a law firm regarding your separation from Carter Sullivan. We request immediate contact to discuss settlement terms. The third was from Carter. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We both know this marriage was over. Let's handle this like adults. Grace read that last message 3 times. Like adults, as if abandoning your dying wife was mature behavior. Ruby appeared with tea and toast. Eat. Then we make a plan. I don't have money for lawyers, Grace said. He emptied the accounts. Ruby's expression hardened. That's illegal. Marital assets during separation. With what do I fight? Grace asked. I'm a nurse making $53,000 a year. He's a Sullivan. Then we find someone who hates rich bastards more than they love money. Ruby said, I know just the person. She made a 7-minute phone call. When she hung up, she was smiling. Mitchell Crane, plaintiff's attorney, takes cases on contingency when he believes in them. He'll see you tomorrow. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., she took a taxi back to Mount Sinai, spending her last $40. Sarah let her into NICU after hours. Grace stood between the 2 incubators, one hand on each warm glass surface, and finally cried. Not silent tears, full-body sobs. I'm here, Grace whispered. Mama's here. I'm so sorry I left. Noah stirred, his tiny fist uncurling. Logan's breathing evened out. They knew her voice. Dr. Ford found her an hour later, still standing, still whispering promises. You should be resting. Doctor, Ford said gently, I should be with my sons. Grace replied, they'll be here at least another week. You can't stand guard 24 hours. Watch me. Doctor, Ford studied Grace's face. Come to my office in the small, cluttered space. Dr. Ford pulled out a folder. Hospital policy says I can't give you this, but I'm giving it anyway. Inside were itemized bills, the delivery, emergency surgery, 2 NICU admissions. The total exceeded $200,000. Your insurance was terminated retroactively, Dr. Ford said. They're claiming Carter notified them of separation before delivery. That's a lie, Grace said. Can you prove it? Grace couldn't. No documentation. No witnesses. Nothing except her word against his. There's EMTALA, Dr. Ford said. Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. The hospital can't refuse emergency care regardless of ability to pay. These bills can't touch you immediately, but eventually they'll come for collection. How long? Months? Maybe a year. She paused. Grace, I've never seen a man walk out mid-delivery. Never. If you decide to fight this, I'll testify. What he did isn't just cruel. It might be criminal. Criminal abandonment during medical emergency, spousal support violations. He left you to die. Grace, that matters. For the first time since delivery, Grace felt anger, clean and sharp and clarifying. Ruby arranged a meeting with Mitchell Crane at a Brooklyn diner. Grace arrived early, wearing Ruby's clothes because she couldn't face the apartment she'd shared with Carter. Mitchell Crane was mid-40s, wearing a worn suit, with tired eyes. But when he looked at Dr. Ford's folder, his expression shifted to something fierce. I'll take your case, he said before Grace finished explaining. No retainer, contingency basis. When we win, I take a third. If we lose, you own nothing. Why? Grace asked. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Because 15 years ago, my sister was in your exact position. Her husband walked out during premature labor. She died of complications. Her baby survived 2 days. His hands gripped the coffee cup hard enough Grace thought it might shatter. These men think they can walk away. Mitchell continued. They think money and lawyers protect them. Sometimes they're right, but not this time. What do we do first? Grace asked. First, we file for emergency spousal support. Mitchell said. Second, court order for DNA testing. Carter will claim those babies aren't his. We prove they are. Third, we go after the insurance fraud, retroactively canceling coverage during active labor illegal. Fourth, we find where that $87,000 went. He's hiding assets. We're going to find every penny. How long will this take? Months. Mitchell admitted. These cases are brutal. He'll drag it out, make it painful. Try to exhaust you until you settle for pennies. I don't have months. Grace said, I have 2 sons in NICU who need their mother. Then we work fast, Mitchell said, and smart. I've got investigators who owe me favors. We'll find the dirt on Carter Sullivan. Trust me, men like him always have dirt. Grace looked at this stranger offering to fight her battle for nothing but the chance to win. Okay, she said, let's destroy him. Mitchell smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this fight for 15 years. Now you're talking my language. Outside, New York moved on with relentless pace. But inside that worn booth, Grace Bennett and Mitchell Crane were planning something that would shake the Sullivan empire. Because Carter had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Grace would stay broken. He'd underestimated what a mother would do for her children. And that miscalculation would cost him everything. William Sullivan's office occupied the entire 52nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, with views that stretched from the Hudson to the East River. Grace had been there once before, 3 years ago, when Carter brought her to meet his father for the first time. She'd felt small then, intimidated by the wealth and power that seemed to radiate from every polished surface. She felt different now. Mitchell accompanied her, carrying a briefcase full of documentation that represented 2 weeks of relentless investigation. Ruby stayed with the twins at Mount Sinai, texting updates every hour like clockwork. Noah's oxygen levels improving. Logan took full feeding. They're fighters, just like their mama. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 30s, looked uncomfortable as she led them to the conference room. Mr. Sullivan will be with you shortly, she said. Avoiding Grace's eyes, they waited 15 minutes. A power play. Mitchell recognized it immediately and used the time to arrange documents across the mahogany table in deliberate order. Medical records here, bank statements there, text message transcripts in the center like an accusation. When William Sullivan entered, he brought 2 other men with him, lawyers. Mitchell noted immediately, the expensive kind. Grace, William said warmly, as if they were meeting for lunch instead of warfare. You look well, considering. How are my grandsons? The possessive pronoun didn't escape Mitchell's attention, already claiming ownership. Classic move. They're alive, Grace said flatly. No thanks to your son. William's smile faltered. That's why we're here, to make things right. He gestured to the lawyers. This is Richard Sullivan from our family legal team, and James Mitchell from corporate counsel. We've prepared a very generous offer. One of the lawyers slid a folder across the table. Grace didn't touch it. Mitchell did, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. His expression gave nothing away. $100,000, the lawyer said. Full custody to you. No contest. Carter waives all parental rights. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and release the Sullivan family from any further claims or legal action. Mitchell closed the folder. No. William blinked. I'm sorry, no. Mitchell repeated, we're not interested in your hush money. The lawyer's jaw tightened. Miss Bennett, this is an extremely fair offer. The average custody settlement in New York is significantly less. Average custody settlements, Mitchell said, don't involve fathers who abandon their wives during life-threatening medical emergencies. Average custody settlements don't include insurance fraud and asset concealment. Average custody settlements don't come with criminal exposure. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. This is a motion we'll be filing Monday morning. Emergency spousal support based on marital lifestyle. We're asking for $20,000 per month backdated to the separation date, plus full medical coverage restoration, plus reimbursement for all expenses related to the twins' care. $20,000, William repeated. That's absurd. Your son lives in a $3 million apartment in Tribeca, Mitchell said calmly. He drives a $200,000 Mercedes. His American Express bills average $30,000 per month. $20,000 for his wife and infant sons is not absurd. It's conservative. The lawyers exchanged glances. William leaned back in his chair, his warm facade cracking. Grace, be reasonable. You're a nurse. You make, what, $50,000 a year. You can't afford a legal battle against this family. Take the settlement. Give your boys a stable life. Grace spoke for the first time since the folder appeared. You want to buy my silence? I want to ensure my grandchildren are provided for. William corrected. Then pay child support. Grace said, 25,000 per month, full medical coverage, college fund, and Carter maintains supervised visitation because those boys deserve to know their father. Even if he's a coward. The room went very quiet. William's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Grace said, standing up. The mistake was thinking I'd take your money and disappear. I'm not going anywhere. Those boys are Sullivan's, whether you like it or not. And I'm going to make damn sure Carter pays for what he did. She walked out, Mitchell following with his briefcase. The lawyers called after them. But Grace didn't stop until they reached the elevator bank. That, Mitchell said once the doors closed, was perfect. Absolutely perfect. What happens now? Grace asked. Now they panic. Mitchell said, we just rejected a six-figure settlement without blinking. That tells them we know something they don't. They'll scramble to figure out what leverage we have. Do we have leverage? Mitchell smiled. More than they realize. My investigator pulled Carter's credit card records. He's been spending money like water. Tiffany, Cartier, five-star restaurants, all in the past 3 months. So he's dating someone. Not just dating, Mitchell said. Preparing to propose. He bought an engagement ring 2 weeks before your due date. The elevator dropped, taking Grace's stomach with it. He was planning to leave me before the babies were even born. Looks that way. And here's where it gets interesting. Mitchell pulled out his phone, showing Grace a photo. This is Vivian Ross, public relations executive. She's been all over Carter's credit card statements. Grace stared at the woman in the photo. Beautiful, polished. Everything Grace currently wasn't. You think she knew about me? I think she's about to find out she wasn't the only one being lied to, Mitchell said. Because I also found this. He swiped to another photo. A prenatal vitamin prescription, filled at a pharmacy in Tribeca. Patient name Vivian Ross. Date 2 months ago. She's pregnant. Grace breathed. Carter's juggling 2 pregnant women. Mitchell confirmed. And my bet Vivian has no idea you exist. Grace leaned against the elevator wall. Processing. So what do? We let her keep thinking that, Mitchell said, until the moment it helps us most. Right now, Carter thinks he's in control. He's got his father's lawyers, his family's money, and a new life all planned out with Vivian. What he doesn't have is the truth, which is that I'm not going away. Grace said, exactly. And when the truth comes out, when Vivian finds out about you, when William realizes his son is a bigger liability than asset, when the media gets wind of this story, Carter's perfect little escape plan crumbles. The elevator reached the ground floor. Grace stepped out into the gleaming marble lobby, surrounded by the same wealth and power that had intimidated her years ago. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Her phone buzzed. Ruby Noah's breathing tube came out. He's doing it on his own. Come see. Grace showed Mitchell the text. I need to get back to the hospital. Go, Mitchell said. I'll file the motions Monday. And Grace, we're going to win this. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but we're going to win. Grace nodded and headed for the subway, leaving the glass tower behind. In her wake, lawyers scrambled and William Sullivan made phone calls, and Carter received a text that made his blood run cold. She rejected the settlement. What the hell did you tell her? But Grace wasn't thinking about any of them. She was thinking about Noah breathing on his own, about Logan getting stronger every day, about the 2 lives that depended on her staying upright when everything else wanted to knock her down. The subway rattled through darkness toward Mount Sinai, and Grace made a silent promise to her sons. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, you will never wonder if your mother fought for you, because she would, until her last breath. 3 weeks after rejecting the Sullivan settlement, Grace's world imploded. It started with a phone call at 2 in the morning. Miss Bennett, this is Officer Davis from the NYPD. We have your Aunt Ruby Bennett in custody. Grace sat up fast. What? Why assault and battery? She attacked someone outside Mount Sinai Hospital. Grace threw on clothes and took a cab to the 19th precinct, where Ruby sat, looking furious and unrepentant. What happened? Grace demanded. Ruby's jaw was set firm. Carter showed up at the hospital, tried to see the twins. I told him to leave. He pushed past me, so I pushed back. That's assault, the officer said from the doorway. Bail is set at $5,000. Grace's stomach dropped. She didn't have 500. I'll handle it, came Mitchell Crane's voice. He appeared looking exhausted. I called in a favor with a bail bondsman. Hours later, they sat in Mitchell's office. This is bad, he said bluntly. Carter's lawyers will use Ruby's arrest to paint you as unstable. It wasn't like that, Grace protested. Doesn't matter what it was like. Mitchell said, matters what it looks like. Ruby stared into her coffee. I just saw him standing there, smiling, trying to touch those babies, and I lost it. Mitchell pulled out a file. Carter filed an emergency custody motion this morning. He's claiming you're mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. He can't do that. Grace said, he already did. We have a hearing in 4 days. And Grace, he's bringing Vivian. She's pregnant and they're engaged. He'll argue he's providing a stable 2-parent home while you're on your aunt's couch with no income. I have income. I'm going back to work next week as a night shift nurse. Mitchell said gently, who's watching the twins, Ruby? Grace said immediately, the woman who just got arrested. Mitchell pointed out, Grace, Carter's building case that you can't care for these babies. What do we do? She asked. We fight dirty, Mitchell said, because they already are. The next 3 days blurred. Mitchell hired a private investigator. Grace gave statements to a court-appointed social worker. Dr. Ford provided medical records. But the night before the hearing, everything changed. Grace was feeding Logan when her phone rang. Unknown number. Miss Bennett, this is Detective Morrison. I need to speak with you about Carter Sullivan. What about him? When was the last time you accessed his personal computer? I never accessed his computer, Grace said. Why, someone did. 3 weeks ago, using your IP address. They copied confidential financial documents. That's computer fraud. Miss Bennett, federal offense. I didn't touch his computer, Grace protested. I was in the hospital. Then at my aunt's. Can you prove that? The detective's voice softened. Look, I believe you, but Carter Sullivan is filing charges. If convicted, you're looking at up to 5 years in federal prison. Grace hung up and called Mitchell immediately. They're coming after me for computer fraud, Grace said, voice shaking. Carter's claiming I hacked his computer. Did you? No, I swear. Mitchell was quiet. Then this is a setup. They're trying to discredit you before the custody hearing. How do we prove it? We don't have time, Mitchell admitted. The hearing is tomorrow. Best we can do is argue it's a fabrication. The custody hearing took place in a windowless courtroom. Judge Patricia Winters presided with tired eyes that had seen too many families destroy each other. Carter arrived with his lawyers, his father William, and Vivian Ross, visibly pregnant and wearing a diamond ring. Grace arrived with Mitchell and Ruby, feeling like a refugee. The proceedings started badly. Carter's lawyer painted Grace as unstable, trapped Carter with pregnancy, and now refused reasonable settlement offers. Miss Bennett has no stable income. The lawyer said, no permanent residence. Her only family support just assaulted my client. When Mitchell's turn came, he came out swinging. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan abandoned his wife during a life-threatening medical emergency. He emptied their bank account. He terminated her health insurance during active labor. Judge Winters looked at Carter. Mr. Sullivan, why did you leave the hospital that night? Carter stood, expression practiced. Your Honor, I was overwhelmed. The pregnancy was high risk, the relationship was failing, and I made a terrible mistake. But I'm here now, ready to take responsibility. By taking responsibility, you mean filing for full custody? Mitchell interjected. I mean providing a stable home. Carter countered. Vivian stood, hand on her stomach. Your Honor, Carter and I are building a family. We have a 4-bedroom home in Westchester, full-time childcare, and financial resources. Grace stood, ignoring Mitchell's warning. Your Honor, Carter Sullivan walked out while I was dying. He left before his sons were born. He emptied our accounts and disappeared for 3 weeks. Now he shows up with a pregnant fiancée and acts like father of the year. Her voice cracked. I don't have a mansion. I have a couch in Queens. But I was there, every single day in that NICU, every feeding, every setback. Where was he? The courtroom was silent. Judge Winters looked at Carter. Do you have an answer? Carter's lawyer stood. My client deeply regrets his initial reaction, But past mistakes don't negate present capabilities. Then prove it, Mitchell said, pulling out a folder. These are Carter Sullivan's credit card statements. $50,000 spent on luxury items while his sons fought for their lives in NICU. Judge Winters reviewed them. Expression darkening. Mr. Sullivan, did you visit your children in the hospital? Carter hesitated. I was advised by my lawyers to avoid contact until custody was established. So that's a no, the judge said. Judge Winters called a recess. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Grace stood in the hallway watching Carter and Vivian whisper urgently. She saw Vivian's expression change as she read something on Carter's phone. Vivian grabbed Carter's arm, voice rising. What is this? What do you mean they're yours? Keep your voice down. Carter hissed. You told me you were divorced, Vivian said, tears starting. You said the babies weren't even yours. Vivian turned to Grace. Did you know he was with me? Grace met her eyes not until 2 weeks ago. Vivian looked at Carter with hatred. You're a liar. She yanked off the engagement ring and threw it at his chest. Keep it, she stormed off, leaving Carter alone with his lawyer scrambling. When court resumed, Judge Winters looked decided. I'm awarding temporary full custody to Grace Bennett. She said, Mr. Sullivan will have supervised visitation, 2 hours per week, pending parenting classes, and psychological evaluation. Carter shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's not fair. Sit down. Mr. Sullivan, the judge said coldly, you abandoned your wife during childbirth. You've shown no interest in your children. Until you prove otherwise, you're a danger to their emotional well-being. She looked at Grace. Miss Bennett, this is temporary. We'll reconvene in 60 days. I expect stable housing and employment. Yes, Your Honor, Grace said, tears streaming. Court adjourned. Grace walked out into sunlight feeling like she could breathe. Ruby hugged her tight. Mitchell grinned. Behind them, Carter stood with his lawyers, his father already walking away. Grace's phone buzzed. Dr. Ford twins ready for discharge tomorrow. Come get your boys. Grace read it twice. Then she looked up at the sky and whispered, We're going home. Grace brought Noah and Logan home to Ruby's apartment on a Wednesday morning in October. The twins bundled in donated car seats and wearing onesies from the hospital gift shop. The apartment felt impossibly small for 3 people and 2 infants, but it was theirs, and it was safe, and that was enough. For 72 hours, Grace lived in a fog of feedings and diaper changes and the particular exhaustion that comes from newborn twins. Ruby helped when she could, but at 60 years old, the sleepless nights were taking their toll. Grace survived on coffee and adrenaline and the fierce love that made everything else bearable. On Saturday, Mitchell called. We have a problem. Grace switched the phone to speaker while burping Noah. What kind of problem? The kind where Carter's private investigator has been following you. Photos of you leaving Ruby's apartment at odd hours, looking exhausted. Photos of the cramped conditions. They're building a case that you're not capable of caring for the twins. I'm doing everything right. Grace protested. They're fed, clean, healthy. Dr. Ford signed off on their discharge. I know, Mitchell said, but perception matters. And they're going to use these photos to argue that you're overwhelmed and the twins need Carter's resources. Grace looked around the tiny apartment, seeing it through hostile eyes. The crowded space, the makeshift nursery, the evidence of poverty they couldn't hide. What do? We need to move you somewhere better, Mitchell said, and we need to do it fast. The next hearing is in 6 weeks. With what money? Grace asked. I don't even start work until next week, and my first paycheck won't come for 2 more weeks after that. Mitchell hesitated. There might be someone who can help, but you're not going to like it. Who? Ethan Blackwood. Grace's hand stilled. Ethan Blackwood, the investor. She'd met him once at a charity event Carter dragged her to, back when she still believed her marriage was real. He'd been kind, funny, and Carter had hated him on sight for reasons Grace never understood. Why would Ethan Blackwood help me? Grace asked. Because Carter embezzled from his fund. Mitchell said, $3 million over 2 years. Ethan's been investigating, but Carter's hidden the money so well, even forensic accountants can't find it. But if you help us find it, Ethan will provide whatever you need. You want me to help a stranger go after my husband? Ex-husband, Mitchell corrected. Technically still married. But let's not split hairs. And Grace, Carter stole from him, just like he stole from you. Grace looked at her sons, sleeping peacefully in their bassinets. Everything she did now was for them. Everything she would ever do was for them. Set up the meeting, she said. Ethan Blackwood's office was in a renovated warehouse in Soho, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. Grace felt out of place in her Target jeans and nursing-stained sweater. But Ethan greeted her with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering coffee she gratefully accepted. "I know this is complicated. That's one word for it," Grace said. They sat in his private conference room, Mitchell taking notes while Ethan laid out the situation. Carter had been his fund's golden boy, bringing in investors and generating impressive returns. But 6 months ago, discrepancies started appearing. Money moving to accounts that didn't exist. Returns that couldn't be verified. "We finally traced it," Ethan said. $3 million to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. "The only person with access to those accounts is Carter." "Can't you just go to the police?" Grace asked. Ethan's expression darkened. "I did. They investigated. Carter's lawyers produced documentation showing the transactions were authorized. Apparently, I signed off on everything. But you didn't," Grace guessed. "I didn't, but my signature is on the paperwork. And handwriting analysis says it's genuine. Either I authorized $3 million in fraudulent transfers and forgot about it, or Carter has access to forgery skills that would make the Secret Service jealous." Grace thought about the Carter she'd known. Charming, confident, always one step ahead. She'd attributed it to intelligence and ambition. Now she wondered how much of it was practiced deception. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Access," Ethan said. "Carter's laptop, his phone records, anything that might show where the money went. You were his wife. You had access to his life." "Had," Grace emphasized. Past tense. "He took everything when he left. But you still have the apartment," Mitchell interjected. "Carter hasn't changed the locks because that would require admitting he abandoned the marital residence. Legally, you still have every right to enter. You want me to break into my own apartment and steal his files?" Grace said, "Not steal." Mitchell corrected. "Retrieve marital property for legal proceedings." "There's a difference, a thin one," Grace muttered. But she was already calculating. If Carter had stolen from Ethan, he'd stolen from others. And if they could prove the pattern of fraud, it changed everything about the custody case. Financial crimes meant instability, meant Carter wasn't the responsible father he claimed to be. "I'll do it," Grace said, "but I need something in return." "Name it," Ethan said. "I need a place to live. Something the court will approve. Something that shows I can provide a stable home for my sons." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I own a building in Brooklyn. 3-bedroom, rent-controlled. It's yours." "I can't afford rent-controlled in Brooklyn," Grace said. "You're not paying," Ethan replied. "Consider it payment for helping me recover $3 million. Grace studied him, looking for the catch. There was always a catch with wealthy men, but Ethan's eyes were steady and honest. "Why are you really helping me?" Grace asked. "Because Carter Sullivan represents everything I hate about this industry." Ethan said, "He's a parasite who takes credit for other people's work and leaves destruction in his wake. You're not the first person he's betrayed. Grace, you're just the first one who might actually take him down." The apartment Carter had shared with Grace occupied the 23rd floor of a luxury building in Tribeca. Grace stood outside the door at midnight, Ruby waiting in the car downstairs as lookout, and tried to remember what courage felt like. Her key still worked. The door swung open silently, revealing the life she'd left behind. Everything was exactly as she remembered, but felt alien now, like walking through a museum exhibit of someone else's existence. Carter's laptop sat on the desk in his study, password protected, but Grace knew the code. His birthday, unimaginative and arrogant. The screen glowed to life, and Grace inserted the thumb drive Mitchell had provided. She was copying files when she heard the elevator ding in the hallway. Grace froze. It was nearly 1 a.m. No one should be coming home now. But footsteps approached the door, and then the lock clicked. Grace barely made it into the bedroom closet before Carter walked in. Vivian beside him. They were arguing. "You promised it was over," Vivian was saying. "You said she was crazy, that the babies probably weren't even yours." "They are mine," Carter snapped. "The DNA test proved it." "So you lied," Vivian said. About everything, I simplified. Carter corrected. The marriage was already over. Vivian? I just hadn't made it official yet. By walking out while she was in labor, Vivian said, Estoy, that's not simplifying. Carter, outside him. That's abandonment. Grace pressed herself against the closet wall, heart hammering. The thumb drive was still in the laptop, files still copying. If Carter went into his study, she was caught. I made a mistake. Carter said, fine, I admit it, but I'm fixing it now. The custody hearing went better than expected. We'll get partial custody. Vivian, the boys will spend weekends with us. With us, Vivian laughed bitterly. There is no us. Carter, I'm not raising another woman's children while you pretend to be father of the year. You're pregnant, Carter said. With my child. We're a family. I'm having an abortion, Vivian said flatly. The apartment went silent. You can't, Carter whispered. Watch me, Vivian said. I'm not bringing a child into this mess. You're a liar and a fraud, and I'm done. She walked out. The door slammed. Carter stood frozen for a long moment, then grabbed a bottle of scotch and poured a drink with shaking hands. Grace stayed in the closet, barely breathing, praying the file transfer would complete. Finally, the laptop beeped softly. Transfer complete. Carter was in the kitchen, back turned. Grace slipped out of the closet, grabbed the thumb drive, and made it to the door. Her hand was on the knob when Carter spoke. I know you're there. Grace. She turned slowly. Carter leaned against the kitchen counter, gotch in hand, looking at her with empty eyes. How long have you been here? He asked. Long enough, Grace said. Come to rob me. Take what's left. Come to get what's mine. Grace corrected. Files? Evidence. Truth, Carter laughed. The sound, hollow. You think you can destroy me with what? Some stolen documents? With the proof that you're not who you pretend to be. Grace said, that you never were. Carter took a long drink. You won't win, Grace. I have money, lawyers, connections. You have a couch in Queens and an aunt with an assault charge. I have our sons, Grace said quietly. And the truth, that's more than you'll ever have. She walked out before he could respond, taking the elevator down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Ruby was waiting, the car running. Did you get it? Ruby asked. Grace held up the thumb drive. Everything. They drove back to Queens in silence. Grace processing what she'd heard. Vivian was leaving Carter, getting an abortion. The perfect life Carter had constructed was crumbling just as fast as Grace's had, but Grace felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. At Ruby's apartment, she plugged the thumb drive into Mitchell's laptop. He'd been waiting, drinking coffee at 3 in the morning. Please tell me there's something useful. Mitchell said, there's everything. Grace replied. They spent the rest of the night going through files. Bank statements showing transfers to a dozen shell corporations. Email chains discussing creative accounting. Text messages between Carter and William Sullivan coordinating a strategy to neutralize the Grace situation. And buried deep in a password-protected folder, the smoking gun, an email from Carter to an offshore account manager. Subject line, final transfer before divorce. Body text, move everything. She can't touch what she can't find. Mitchell sat back, stunned. He was planning this before you even went into labor. Months before. Grace confirmed, pointing at the date. He was stealing from everyone, setting up his exit, and I was just another asset to liquidate. Mitchell's jaw was tight. This changes everything. We've got fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Grace, this isn't just a custody case anymore. This is criminal. What do we do? We hand it over to the district attorney, Mitchell said, and we watch Carter Sullivan's world burn. Grace looked at the screen full of evidence, years of lies documented in cold digital text. Part of her wanted revenge, wanted to see Carter lose everything the way she had, but mostly she just wanted it to be over, wanted her sons to grow up without this shadow hanging over them. Do it, she said, whatever it takes. Mitchell made the call, waking up a prosecutor he knew from law school. By dawn, they had a meeting scheduled with the district attorney's office. By noon, an investigation was officially opened. By evening, the news broke. Sullivan Capital Air under investigation for embezzlement and fraud. The headlines spread across financial networks, social media, the morning shows. Grace watched it unfold from Ruby's couch, nursing Logan while Noah slept. Her phone rang constantly, reporters, former friends, people she hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanting her side of the story. She ignored them all except one, Ethan Blackwood. "Thank you," he said when she answered. "The DA just contacted me. They're going to recover the funds." "Good," Grace said. "The apartment in Brooklyn is ready whenever you want to move in." Ethan added, "No pressure. Just wanted you to know." Grace looked around Ruby's cramped space. "I'll come see it tomorrow." "Grace," Ethan said, then paused. "What you did took courage. Most people wouldn't have risked it. Most people don't have two sons depending on them," Grace replied. After she hung up, Ruby appeared with tea. "You did good, kiddo." "I stole files from my husband," Grace said. "Ex-husband," Ruby corrected. "And technically, marital property. You stole nothing. Tell that to Carter's lawyers. Carter's lawyers are about to have bigger problems." Ruby said, "You just handed the DA enough evidence to put him away for years." Grace thought about Carter drinking scotch alone in that empty apartment, his perfect life disintegrating. She should feel victorious. Instead, she just felt tired. "The twins need baths," Grace said, standing up. "Can you help always?" Ruby replied. They spent the evening in the tiny bathroom, washing two squirming babies in the kitchen sink because the apartment had no bathtub. It was chaotic and exhausting and everything Grace never imagined her life would be. But it was real, and it was hers. And for now, that was enough. The apartment Ethan provided was nothing like Carter's Tribeca penthouse. But to Grace, it felt like a palace. 3 bedrooms on the 4th floor of a pre-war building in Park Slope, with windows that caught morning light and floors that creaked with history. There was a nursery for the twins, a bedroom for Grace, and even a small room for Ruby. "We're staying together," Ruby declared while unpacking donated furniture. "You need help with night feedings." Grace didn't argue. The truth was, she needed Ruby more than pride would let her admit. The move happened over a weekend, Mitchell and Ethan both showing up with a rental truck. Grace stood in the empty living room, holding Noah while Logan napped, and tried to remember the last time she felt safe. "How much is the rent really?" Grace asked. "I need to know what I'm getting into." Ethan hesitated. "I told you, it's covered. Nothing's free," Grace said. Ethan met her eyes. "What I want is to see Carter Sullivan face consequences. You already gave me that. The apartment is just me saying thank you. I'm going back to work next week." Grace said, "I'll pay rent when I can." "Fair enough," Ethan said. After he left, Ruby found Grace in the nursery, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" Ruby asked. Grace looked around at the clean walls and space. "Why is he helping me?" "Nobody helps without wanting something." "Maybe he's just a good man," Ruby suggested. "Good men don't exist," Grace said. "Carter proved that." Ruby put an arm around her shoulders. "Carter proved that Carter doesn't exist. That's not the same as all men." The first week was K. Noah had colic and screamed for 3 hours every night. Logan developed a diaper rash that wouldn't heal. Grace slept 4 hours total across 7 days. But on day 8, both babies slept for a 5-hour stretch. Grace woke at dawn to silence, panicked, and found them breathing peacefully. The apartment was quiet. For the first time since the hospital, Grace breathed without her chest aching. Her phone buzzed. "Mitchell DA wants to meet. They have questions about the files. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Grace replied. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office was less glamorous than television suggested. Margaret Foster, the assigned prosecutor, was 45 with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Bennett," Margaret said, "I need to verify information about the documents you provided." They sat in a conference room with Mitchell present. Margaret pulled up files, asking Grace to confirm dates and context. Grace answered carefully, aware everything she said might be used in court. "Can you explain how you obtained Mr. Sullivan's laptop?" Margaret asked. "I used my key to enter the marital apartment." Grace said, "The laptop was community property, and you copied files to an external drive. I preserved evidence of financial irregularities." Grace said, "Mitchell had coached her on the language." Margaret smiled slightly. "You've got a good lawyer. I've got the truth." Grace said, the questioning continued for 2 hours. When Margaret finally closed her laptop, Her expression had shifted to something approving. "Miss Bennett," Margaret said, "your ex-husband is a piece of work. Your evidence connected dots we couldn't before. Does that mean you can prosecute?" Mitchell asked. Margaret nodded. "Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. We're building a case that should put Mr. Sullivan away for significant time. But you need to be prepared for what comes next," which is what Grace asked. "A trial, media attention. Carter's lawyers will attack your credibility, your character, everything. It's going to be brutal." Grace thought about the past 2 months. She'd already survived brutal. "I'm ready," Grace said. After the meeting, Mitchell took Grace to lunch. "You did great." Margaret's impressed. "What happens now?" "Now we wait. The DA builds their case. Meanwhile, we focus on the custody modification hearing next month." Grace poked at her salad. "I'm so tired." "Mitchell, I just want to raise my sons in peace." "I know," Mitchell said gently, "but we're close. Few more months, and this will be over." That night, Grace got home to find Ethan waiting on the building's front steps. "Hope this isn't weird," Ethan said. "I was in the neighborhood. Brooklyn's not really on the way to anywhere," Grace pointed out. Ethan smiled. "Okay, I came to check on you." Mitchell said the DA meeting was today. Grace shifted the diaper bag. "Why do you care?" "Because what Carter did to you is worse than anything he did to me," Ethan said. "Money can be replaced. Trust can't." "You want to come up?" Grace asked. "Ruby's making dinner." "I'd like that," Ethan said. Upstairs, Ruby greeted Ethan warmly, immediately putting him to work setting the table. Dinner was simple but felt almost normal, like a regular family having a regular evening. After Ethan left, Ruby gave Grace a knowing look. "He's nice." "Don't start," Grace warned. "A man who shows up without wanting anything is rare." Ruby said. The custody modification hearing took place on a cold November morning. Grace arrived early, dressed professionally. Carter arrived late, flanked by lawyers but looking diminished. Judge Winters reviewed the file. "Miss Bennett, your housing situation has improved significantly." "Yes, Your Honor," Grace confirmed. "We're in a stable 3-bedroom apartment, and you've returned to work part-time night shift at Mount Sinai." The Guardian's report noted the twins are thriving. Judge Winters continued. "No health concerns. Strong attachment to mother." She turned to Carter. "Mr. Sullivan, you've completed parenting classes." "Yes, Your Honor." Carter said, "Oh, she did." "And you're under investigation for financial crimes." Carter's lawyer stood. "Those are unproven allegations." "Your Honor." "Noted," Judge Winters said. "But the court must consider all factors." "Mr. Sullivan, have you been visiting your children?" Carter hesitated. Work obligations made the scheduled times difficult. "So that's a no," the judge said. Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan has missed 7 out of 8 scheduled visitations." Judge Winters closed the file. "I'm modifying the custody order. Grace Bennett is awarded sole legal and physical custody. Mr. Sullivan's visitation remains supervised, reduced to monthly due to continued absence and pending criminal investigation." Carter's face went white. "Your Honor, that's not fair." "Fair would be holding you accountable for abandonment," Judge Winters said sharply. "This is mercy. Mr. Sullivan." She struck her gavel. Case concluded. Grace walked out into cold sunshine. Mitchell beside her, and finally let herself cry. Not from sadness, from relief so overwhelming it felt like flight. "You won," Mitchell said. "Full custody. We won," Grace corrected. As she headed to the subway, phone held tight with the judge's ruling saved. Grace felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The criminal trial of Carter Sullivan began on a gray January morning with media trucks outside the courthouse and protesters holding signs reading, "Lock him up," and entitled "Rich Boys." Grace watched from across the street, holding cold coffee, trying to remember the man she'd married. She couldn't. That Carter had either never existed or died somewhere between "I do" and the night he walked away. Mitchell appeared beside her. "You don't have to go in. You're not testifying today." "I want to see it," Grace said. "Want to watch him face consequences." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Ethan sat in the gallery, having flown back from London for opening statements. Ruby stayed home with the twins. Prosecutor Margaret Foster stood before the jury, with the confidence of someone holding the winning hand. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a man who believed rules didn't apply to him. Carter Sullivan stole $3 million from investors, manipulated financial records, and when caught, tried to destroy evidence. She clicked a remote. Bank statements lit up the screen. These are the transactions Mr. Sullivan claimed never happened. These are the emails he said didn't exist. These are the lies he told while people like Ethan Blackwood lost their life savings. Carter sat perfectly still in his expensive suit, but Grace saw his knuckles white against the table. Carter's defense attorney countered with a narrative about a young man under pressure, making mistakes, not crimes. The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a master criminal. In reality, he's a son trying to live up to impossible expectations who made poor business decisions. It was thin, and everyone knew it. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Grace attended whenever possible, watching her ex-husband's life dissected publicly. Witnesses testified. Forensic accountants explained shell corporations. Ethan took the stand and calmly destroyed Carter's credibility with documented lies. But the moment that broke everything came in week 2, when the prosecution called on William Sullivan. The courtroom went silent as Carter's father took the stand. William looked older, diminished. Margaret approached with predatory focus. Mr. Sullivan, you're CEO of Sullivan Capital Management. Yes. Were you aware of the fraudulent transactions your son was conducting? William's jaw tightened. Not initially. When discrepancies appeared, I initiated an internal investigation, Moz. What did that reveal? That my son had been systematically stealing from clients and covering tracks with falsified documents. The courtroom erupted. Judge Richard Blackwell called for order. William continued, voice steady but eyes haunted. When did you become aware? Margaret asked. Approximately 6 months before his arrest. And what did you do? William looked directly at his son. I told him to make it right, to return the money and face consequences. He refused. Carter's face crumbled. A father testifying against his son was devastating. During lunch break, Grace found herself in the cafeteria with Ethan. That was brutal. Grace said, it was necessary. Ethan replied, William chose between protecting his son and protecting his company's reputation. Do you feel satisfied? Grace asked. Ethan considered. I feel relieved. Not satisfied. There's no satisfaction in any of this. Grace's phone buzzed. Ruby Noah's running a fever. Nothing serious, but wanted you to know. Grace stood immediately. I need to go. I'll drive you, Ethan said. They drove to Brooklyn in comfortable silence. Grace watched the city blur past. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. The apartment, the testimony, showing up. You don't need to thank me, Ethan said. I do, though. Grace turned to face him. You could have just handed evidence to the DA and walked away. Instead, you've been there for every crisis. Why? Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. Because when Carter stole from me, I felt powerless. Then I watched you fight back with nothing but determination and 2 babies. He glanced at her. You reminded me what courage actually looks like. I'm not courageous, Grace said. I'm just surviving. Surviving when everything tries to break you is courage, Ethan said. At the apartment, Noah's fever had broken. Ruby had handled it, but Grace still spent an hour rocking him, needing the weight of her son. Ethan stayed for dinner, and when he left, he squeezed Grace's hand. Whatever you need, I'm here. After he'd gone, Ruby appeared with that knowing expression. You like him. I appreciate his help. Grace corrected. Grace, you like him. Maybe, Grace admitted. But I can't think about that now. I'm still legally married, raising twin infants, working night shifts. Dating is the least of my priorities. The trial concluded in early February. The jury deliberated less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carter showed no emotion, but Grace saw him flinch at sentencing announcement. Outside, reporters swarmed. Mitchell ran interference while Grace escaped to a taxi, but she heard questions shouted, How does it feel to see your ex-husband convicted? Do you think justice was served? Grace didn't answer. She went home to her sons, fed and bathed them, put them to bed with stories about brave little boys. Sentencing day arrived with cold rain. Carter stood in an orange jumpsuit, all confidence gone. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Blackwell said, you betrayed trust of investors, colleagues, and family. You showed no remorse, only entitlement. He paused. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison on wire fraud charges, 2 years for HIPAA violations concurrent, and 5 years for embezzlement concurrent. Total of 8 years with possibility of parole after 5. The courtroom erupted. Carter's lawyer filed notice of appeal. But Grace heard only the number. 8 years. Her sons would be 90 before their father walked free. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, just bone-tired exhaustion from finally reaching the end. Mitchell found her in the hallway. It's over. Really over. Is it? Grace asked. Because it feels like it'll never really be over. The legal part is, Mitchell said, what comes next is yours to figure out. But the fight is done. Grace hugged this man who'd fought for her when she had nothing. Thank you. Outside, weak sunshine broke through clouds. Grace stood on courthouse steps, breathing air that tasted like freedom. Her phone rang. Ethan, it's done, Grace said. I heard, are you okay? Grace considered. I don't know what okay feels like, but I'm standing. My sons are safe. Maybe that's enough. It's more than enough, Ethan said. Grace, I need to tell you something. I care about you. Not because of Carter or the trial, because you're remarkable and I can't stop thinking about you. Grace's breath caught. Ethan, you don't have to say anything. He interrupted. Just needed you to know. No pressure, just truth. Can we talk when things are calmer? Grace asked. Whenever you're ready. Ethan said, I'll be here. Grace headed to the subway, heart lighter. The future was uncertain and scary. But for the first time since Carter walked away, she wasn't facing it alone. Spring came to Brooklyn with cherry blossoms and warm breezes that turned the city soft around its edges. Grace stood in Prospect Park, watching Noah and Logan toddle across grass, their small hands clutching at dandelions, and felt something dangerously close to peace. 6 months had passed since Carter's sentencing. 6 months of healing that happened so slowly Grace barely noticed until she looked back and saw the distance she'd traveled. The twins were 14 months old now, walking and babbling and developing personalities that made her laugh even during 3 a.m. tantrums. Ruby appeared with coffee, settling onto the bench beside her. They look happy. They are, Grace said finally. So do you, Ruby observed. Grace considered denying it but couldn't. I am, not all the time, but more than before. That's growth, Ruby said. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means surviving and finding joy anyway. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, free for dinner tonight. I found this great Thai place in Cobble Hill. Grace had been seeing Ethan casually, carefully for 3 months. They moved slowly, both aware that Grace was still processing trauma and rebuilding her life. But there was something gentle in how Ethan loved her, patient and steady, that made Grace believe maybe she could trust again. Can't tonight, Grace texted back. Ruby's book club and I'm on twin duty. Tomorrow works. I'll bring breakfast. Grace smiled at the phone. What? And Ruby noticed, you're glowing. I'm not glowing. Grace protested. You're glowing, and it's about time. That evening, after the twins were asleep and Ruby had left for her book club, Grace sat in the quiet apartment sorting through mail. Most of it was junk, but one envelope caught her attention. Official letterhead from Sullivan Capital Management. Inside was a check for $250,000 and a letter from William Sullivan. Dear Grace, the letter began, this represents your settlement from the civil lawsuit against Carter's estate. Additionally, I've established education trusts for Noah and Logan, each funded with $500,000. It won't undo the damage my son caused, but perhaps it provides some security for their future. The letter continued with an apology that felt genuine despite its formal language. William took responsibility for enabling Carter's behavior, for prioritizing reputation over decency, for failing to act when he knew his son was destroying lives. Grace read the letter twice, then looked at the check. $250,000. More money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to quit night shifts, go back to school, give her sons opportunities she'd only dreamed of. She took a photo of the check and texted Mitchell. Is this real? Mitchell called immediately. It's real. William's trying to make amends. The trusts are ironclad. Carter can't touch them, even after he's released. What should I do? Cash it, Mitchell said bluntly. Put it in savings. Use it to build the life you deserve. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood in the twins' nursery watching them breathe. These perfect, small humans who'd survived so much chaos to reach this moment of peace. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, can't wait until tomorrow. Can I call Grace? Stepped into the hallway and dialed. Ethan answered on the first ring. Everything okay? He asked. Grace told him about the check, the trusts, William's letter. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? He asked finally. Confused. Grace admitted, this money doesn't erase what Carter did, but it makes things easier. And I don't know if I should feel grateful or angry. Maybe both, Ethan suggested. Maybe you can accept the help while still acknowledging the harm. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Grace leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. When did you get so wise? When I met you, Ethan said. You taught me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about healing anyway. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. I want to see you tomorrow. I'll be there at 8 with bagels and coffee, Ethan promised. After they hung up, Grace went back to the nursery and sat between the cribs, one hand on each sleeping child. She thought about the past year, the abandonment, the poverty, the battle, the victory. She thought about how much she'd lost and how much she'd gained. And slowly, carefully, she let herself imagine a future that included not just survival but joy. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in May. Grace signed papers in Mitchell's office, her hands steady, her heart calm. Carter signed in from prison, and just like that, 3 years of marriage officially ended. Grace Bennett was a single woman again, a single mother of twins, a nursing student working toward her nurse practitioner degree, a woman who'd survived abandonment and poverty in a legal war that tried to break her. She was also, surprisingly, happy. That weekend, Ethan took Grace and the twins to the Bronx Zoo. It was chaotic and exhausting and perfect. Logan screamed at the lions. Noah tried to climb into the penguin exhibit. Grace laughed so hard she cried, and Ethan looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Later, with the twins asleep in their stroller, they sat on a bench eating ice cream and watching the sunset over the city. I love you, Ethan said. Not because you're brave or strong or any of those things, though you are, just because you're you. Grace felt her heart skip. She'd been so broken when they met, so convinced she'd never trust anyone again. But Ethan had been patient, showing up without demanding anything, proving through consistent presence that love didn't have to hurt. I love you too, Grace said, and I'm terrified. Of what? Of ruining this, of bringing my mess into your life, of not being enough. Ethan set down his ice cream and took her hand. Grace, you survived your husband walking out while you were dying. You raised twins in poverty while fighting a legal war. You put a criminal in prison and rebuilt your entire life from nothing. He smiled. If anything, I'm the one who's not enough. You're more than enough, Grace said. You're everything I didn't know I needed. They kissed while tourists walked past and the twins slept peacefully, and Grace felt something click into place. Not healing, she wasn't healed. Might never be completely, but wholeness. The recognition that broken things could still be beautiful. That night, back at the apartment, Ruby made dinner while Grace gave the twins their bath. It was routine and domestic and wonderfully boring. All the things Grace had once taken for granted and now treasured. Ethan stayed, as he often did now, reading stories to Noah and Logan in silly voices that made them giggle. Ruby watched from the doorway and smiled at Grace. This is good, Ruby whispered. This is everything, Grace corrected. Later, after the twins were asleep and Ruby had retired to her room, Grace and Ethan sat on the couch in comfortable silence. Grace's head rested on his shoulder. Her body finally relaxed in a way it hadn't been for over a year. I've been thinking, Ethan said carefully, about the future. Grace tensed slightly. What about it? I want to be in it. Officially, not just as your boyfriend, but as a partner. Someone the twins can count on. Ethan, Grace started. I'm not proposing. Ethan said quickly. Not yet. You've been through too much too fast. But I want you to know my intentions. I'm all in. Grace, whenever you're ready. Grace turned to look at him. This man who'd shown up during her darkest moment and stayed through everything after. What did I do to deserve you? You survived. Ethan said simply. That's all you had to do. Grace kissed him, soft and slow, and felt the last of her walls come down. She'd been so afraid of trusting again, of letting someone close enough to hurt her. But Ethan had earned that trust through patience and consistency, and love that asked for nothing except the chance to stay. Maybe, Grace thought, maybe this is what healing looks like. Not forgetting the past, but building something new despite it. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing. And inside the Brooklyn apartment that had become home, Grace Bennett finally let herself believe in second chances. The Prospect Park bandshell was decorated with balloons and streamers, a toddler case of primary colors and sticky fingers. Noah and Logan's second birthday party was small, just Ruby, Mitchell, Dr. Ford, Ethan, and a few other NICU nurses who'd become family. But it was perfect. Grace stood beside the homemade cake, watching her sons demolish frosting with the focused intensity of tiny demolition experts, and felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Complete, Mitchell approached with his wife Sarah, who just had their first baby. "Congratulations on finishing your NP program," he said, raising a plastic cup of punch and toast. "Congratulations on finally getting some sleep," Grace countered, nodding at the infant carrier. "Not happening anytime soon," Sarah said with a tired smile. "But worth it." Grace understood. Everything hard was worth it when you love the result. Dr. Ford appeared with a gift bag. "For the boys," she said. Grace opened it to find 2 small stethoscopes and toy doctor's kits. "Starting them early, you never know," Dr. Ford said. "Maybe they'll follow their mother into medicine, or their mother will finally take a vacation." Ruby interjected. "When was the last time you took a day off?" Grace couldn't remember. Between finishing her nurse practitioner program and working part-time at Mount Sinai and raising twins, rest was theoretical. But she was happy, exhausted and stressed, and constantly worried about money and childcare and whether she was doing enough. But happy. Ethan found her later, after the cake was demolished and presents opened and toddlers crashed from sugar highs. The twins were napping in their stroller, identical curls damp with sweat and frosting still smeared on their cheeks. "They're perfect," Ethan said, crouching beside the stroller. "They're disasters," Grace corrected fondly. "Perfect disasters." He stood and took Grace's hand. "Can we talk?" They walked to a quiet spot under the trees, away from the party noise. Ethan looked nervous, which was unusual for him. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. "Nothing's wrong," Ethan said. "Everything's right. That's why I need to ask you something." He pulled a small box from his pocket, and Grace's breath caught. "I know we said not yet," Ethan continued. "I know you're still healing and the twins are young and timing is never perfect. But Grace, I love you. I love Noah and Logan. I want to be their father. Officially. I want to be your husband." He opened the box. Inside was a simple diamond ring, elegant and understated. Nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Carter had bought. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," Ethan said. "I'm asking you to believe that what comes next can be better. Will you marry me?" Grace looked at this man who'd shown up during her worst moment and stayed through everything after, who read bedtime stories in silly voices and changed diapers without complaint and held her during nightmares about the hospital, who'd proven through 1,000 small actions that love could be patient and kind and safe. "Yes," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring on her finger, and they kissed while parkgoers applauded and Ruby shouted something inappropriate, and the twins slept through their mother's second chance at happiness. That evening, after the party had ended and guests departed, Grace sat on her couch between sleeping twins, engagement ring catching lamplight. Ruby was in the kitchen making tea, and Ethan had run out for Thai takeout. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Grace almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Grace, the voice was tentative, uncertain. "Carter." Grace's stomach dropped. "How did you get this number?" "Doesn't matter. I needed to talk to you. We have nothing to talk about," Grace said, her voice cold. "Please, just listen." Grace should have hung up, should have blocked the number and never thought about it again. But some part of her, the part that had loved him once, couldn't quite let go. "What do you want?" "Carter, I heard you're engaged." To Ethan Blackwood. "Who told you that prison guards read the news?" Carter said bitterly. "You're in the society pages now. Nurse who brought down Wall Street heir finds love with tech investor. They love a good redemption story." "This isn't about you," Grace said. "Isn't it?" Carter's laugh was hollow. "You took everything from me, Grace. My career, my freedom, my family. And now you're marrying the man whose testimony put me here. You took everything from yourself. Grace corrected. I just refused to go down with you. Silence stretched between them. Grace heard Carter breathing, heard something that might have been regret or might have been rage. Do you ever think about what we could have been, Carter asked quietly. If things had been different, no. Grace said, because things were never different. You were always who you are. I just finally saw it. The twins are beautiful, Carter said. I see pictures. Someone sends them anonymously to my mom's address. They don't need you, Grace said firmly. They have everything they need. Do they have a father? They will. Ethan's adopting them after we're married. Carter made a sound like he'd been punched. You're erasing me. No. Grace said, you erased yourself. I'm just making sure they're protected from that damage. She hung up before Carter could respond. Her hands shook. Ruby appeared with tea. Was that him? Ruby asked. Grace nodded. He called to congratulate me on my engagement. Or maybe to remind me he exists. I'm not sure. Does he still have power over you? Grace looked at her sleeping sons, at the engagement ring on her finger, at the life she'd built from rubble. No, she said, he doesn't. And it was true. Carter was a chapter in her story, but he wasn't the whole book. She'd survived him, grown beyond him, built something better in his absence. When Ethan returned with dinner, he took one look at Grace's face and set down the bags. What happened? Carter called. Grace said, I handled it. Ethan pulled her close. You okay? I am, Grace said. Surprised to find it true. He's just noise now. He can't touch what we have. They ate dinner surrounded by twins and Case and the comfortable mess of real life. And Grace realized this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy despite it. Later, after the twins were bathed and storied and sleeping, Grace stood in their nursery doorway watching them breathe. Two miracles born from crisis, growing strong despite everything. Her phone buzzed. Mitchell heard about the engagement. Congratulations. You deserve every happiness. Grace smiled and texted back, thank you for fighting for us. None of this happens without you. Mitchell, you fought for yourself. I just provided the weapons. Grace thought about the past 2 years, the night Carter left, the poverty and struggle, the legal battles and small victories, the slow, painful climb from survival to something better. She thought about the woman she'd been naive, trusting, broken in the woman she'd become. Stronger, yes, but also softer in ways that mattered, more compassionate, more aware of her own strength. Ethan appeared behind her, wrapping arms around her waist. What are you thinking about everything? Grace said, how far we've come. How far you've come, Ethan corrected. I just got to be here for the journey. Grace turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd changed her definition of love. We saved each other, she said. Both true. They stood in the doorway watching twins sleep, and Grace felt the last piece of her heart click into place. Not healed, she carried scars that would never fully fade, but whole, complete, ready for whatever came next, because she'd survived the worst and found something beautiful on the other side. And that, Grace thought, was its own kind of miracle. The wedding took place on a Saturday in October, exactly 2 years after the night Carter left. Grace chose the date deliberately, reclaiming what had once been trauma and transforming it into celebration. They married in Prospect Park under trees turning gold and red, with 50 guests who'd earned their place through presence during the hard times. Noah and Logan served as ring bearers, toddling down the aisle in tiny suits and dropping petals everywhere except where they were supposed to go. The chaos was perfect. Ruby officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose. She stood at the front beaming while Grace and Ethan exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Grace spoke first, her voice steady. 2 years ago, I thought my life was ending. I was broken and terrified and convinced I'd never trust anyone again. She looked at Ethan. Then you showed up. Not to rescue me, I didn't need rescuing, but to stand beside me while I rescued myself. She paused, collecting herself. You taught me that love doesn't have to hurt. That partnership means showing up consistently, not just during the easy parts. That family is what we build, not just what we're born into. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. I can't promise I won't still have nightmares. I can't promise I'm completely healed. But I can promise that I'll love you with everything I've rebuilt myself to be. And I can promise that Noah and Logan will grow up knowing what a real father looks like. Ethan's turn. He pulled out note cards, then set them aside. I had a whole speech prepared, he said. But watching Grace walk down that aisle, I realized there's only one thing that matters. He took her hands. Grace, you are the bravest person I've ever met. Not because you survived what Carter did, though that took incredible strength, but because after surviving, you chose to love again. You chose to trust again. You chose to believe that goodness still exists. His voice thickened. I promise to earn that trust every single day. I promise to be the father Noah and Logan deserve. I promise that when you wake up from nightmares, I'll be there. When you're exhausted and overwhelmed, I'll be there. When you need space to heal, I'll be there, poet. He smiled. And when you're ready to laugh and dance and live fully again, I'll be there for that too. Because being there is what love means. Ruby pronounced them married, and they kissed while guests applauded and the twins shouted incomprehensible toddler approval. Mitchell and his wife Sarah threw rose petals. Dr. Ford took photos. The moment was imperfect and chaotic and exactly what Grace needed. The reception took place in a community center they'd rented for $200, decorated with fairy lights and borrowed folding tables. There was no champagne fountain or ice sculpture or luxury that Carter would have insisted upon. Just good food and better company, and the kind of joy that comes from surviving hell together. Mitchell gave a toast. I've known Grace for 2 years, he said. In that time, I've watched her lose everything and rebuild from nothing. I've watched her fight battles that would have destroyed most people. And I've watched her do it all while raising 2 incredible kids and still finding time to be kind. He raised his glass. So here's to Grace, the strongest person in this room, and to Ethan, who had the wisdom to recognize that strength and love it. The party continued into evening. Grace danced with Ethan while the twins ran wild with Ruby chasing them. She danced with Mitchell and his wife. She danced with doctors, Ford, and the NICU nurses who'd saved her son's lives. And when slow songs played, she let Ethan hold her close and whispered thank you into his shoulder for being exactly what she needed when she needed it most. Later, when the party wound down and guests departed, Grace stood outside the community center, watching stars appear over Brooklyn. Ethan appeared with her coat. Ready to go home, he asked. Grace looked at him, this good man who'd chosen her, despite her scars, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Yes, she said. Let's go home. They collected the twins from Ruby, who was staying at their apartment for the night to give the newlyweds privacy at a hotel downtown. Grace kissed each sleeping child, breathing in their baby soap smell, marveling as always that they existed. In the hotel room, Grace stood by the window looking out at the city that had witnessed her destruction and reconstruction. Ethan came up behind her, resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking, he asked. That I made it, Grace said. I actually made it to the other side. You did, Ethan confirmed, and I'm so proud of you. Grace turned to face him. Thank you for waiting, for being patient while I figured out how to be whole again. Ethan kissed her forehead. You were always whole, Grace. You just had to believe it. That night, Grace dreamed not of hospitals and abandonment, but of Noah and Logan grown and happy, of Ethan gray-haired and steady beside her, of a future built on foundation of survival and strength. When she woke, Ethan was already awake, watching her with soft eyes. Mornings, Mrs. Blackwood, he said. Grace smiled. It still felt strange. That name, strange but good. Morning, she replied. They had breakfast in bed, talked about honeymoon plans they couldn't afford yet, made love slowly and carefully because Grace's body still carried trauma that required gentleness. And then they went home to their sons and their life and the beautiful ordinary chaos of being a family.